Hello, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Rethinking Work at Midlife and Beyond. My name is Kate Schaefers, and I am Director of Lifelong Learning Programs at the University of Minnesota, which includes the Midlife Academy. Let me briefly introduce my colleague, Dr. Brianna Smith. Bree, could you show your camera? Bree has been involved with the Midlife Academy from the start. And in addition to all that she does to bring lifelong learning programming to you, she also hosts our Midlife Academy podcast series. Now, let me introduce our speaker today and our colleague, Marci Alboher. Marci is a leading authority on career issues and workplace trends. She's Chief Engagement Officer at CoGenerate, an organization that supports the power of connecting, collaborating, and innovating across generations. She's a former blogger and columnist for the New York Times, and her book, The Encore Career Handbook: How to Make a Living and a Difference in the Second Half of Life, has had a big impact on so many people, myself included. She also wrote a book, One Person, Multiple Careers: The Original Guide to the Slash Career. Marci is regularly called upon for commentary in media outlets around the world, including NBC's Today and Nightly News, National Public Radio, and USA Today. And she's also on the faculty of the Modern Elder Academy and Union Theological Seminary's Encore Transition Program. And a few careers ago, she spent a decade in practicing law, and she lives in New York City with her husband, Jay. Marci, I am just thrilled to have you here today.
It's a delight to be here with all of you and Kate and everyone at the Midlife Academy. I know you are the pioneers in this space, so it's exciting to be here.
So, Marci, I'm going to ask you some questions. We can get into a conversation, and then Bree's going to join us, and she's going to be monitoring the chat or the Q&A. So we'll spend part of the time you and I talking, and then we'll also open it up to everyone else. So I just want to start off with, let's talk about your story, how you got where you're at today.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can't help saying that I got interested in this work kind of long before it felt personally relevant, and I'm now 60, and this work feels even more relevant than almost 20 years ago when I started paying attention to what was going to happen to all of us as we enter these like second and third chapters of life. So, as you mentioned, in my immediate prior career, I was a journalist and I was writing about the future of work and careers for the New York Times. And that's been kind of an obsession of mine for quite a while. I've been, as a career kind of changer myself, I get really interested in how we stay relevant as we kind of constantly evolve and morph into who we become at the same time that the world around us is changing all the time. And I was writing this column for the New York Times called Shifting Careers. And I came to be aware of the work of our friend Mark Friedman, who's the founder of the organization where I now work. And he had just written a book called Encore: Finding Work That Matters in the Second Half of Life. And I read that book, and it pretty much changed my life. I really started realizing that we weren't paying attention to this big demographic shift that was happening in our society with 10,000 people turning 50 every day. Yet we were living in a way without adequate pathways to help people figure out what their next stage of life was going to be about. And we had a kind of an outdated notion that we don't need the talent in older people in our society. So I got very interested in this work and I started writing about it more and more. At the same time, I went through a personal transition myself. In 2008, we were in the midst of a recession, and the New York Times abruptly canceled my column and blog. So I was a freelancer trying to figure out what to do next. And I wrote about it in my column. I wrote about being sacked from my main livelihood just at the same time as I was writing about other people and their career struggles. And Mark Friedman called me after seeing that column. I had already been committed to go speaking at a national conference of what was then called Encore.org, which is the organization where I now work. And I had said that I wouldn't be able to accept payment because I was a journalist and I had already covered the work of this organization. And Mark said to me, I'm calling because I see you're no longer going to be writing for the New York Times. So now we can pay you to come speak. So this kind of very bad thing in my life, getting laid off, quickly turned into a very interesting opportunity. I went to that conference and I probably met you there, Kate, because that is where I met all of the pioneers of this movement. And shortly after that, Mark invited me to come and join this organization. And we've been, among the people who've been looking at how do we not just help individuals navigate this life stage, but how do we shape institutions so that we are building more infrastructure for people to be thinking, to harness the talent of people as we age.
Yeah. And so, what is it about midlife do you think that makes this especially ripe for us having these conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I think anyone who's been working for, and living for, 20, 30 years of a career starts to realize that there is another chapter opening up that feels different than what came before, that feels different than kind of what you did at your primary career. And if we're lucky enough to experience the longevity that our generations are starting to see, it becomes clear that the map of life, which we used to follow, which is you get educated, you work, you retire, and you kind of go off into the sunset and do whatever people do at that life stage. It doesn't make sense anymore. Many of us want to have another meaningful chapter, whether that's continued work, whether that's volunteering in civic or activism, whether that's more time with family, whether it's sometime finding a new sense of purpose. But there is a big horizon ahead. And we're having a collective awakening about that.
Mhm. Well, and it also seems like the kind of work that we might have done earlier in our career isn't fitting the same way. Maybe there's other ways that we're looking to work at this life stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not one size fits all, Kate. As we know, there are people who want to work steadily. There are people who, after 20 or 30 years of doing something, realize they had a neglected dream or discover a new passion, a new interest. And the world is changing, delivering new kinds of work that didn't exist when we may have made a career choice decades earlier. So there is no one way that it's unfolding. It's really different for different people.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, as people are trying to navigate this, there aren't those roadmaps, as you mentioned, and in that infrastructure that helps people figure out how to navigate those transitions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know this better than anyone with the work you do with the Nexel Collaborative. And I don't know if you want to even explain that to people, but there are now institutions all over the country who are serving the population of people who are trying to figure out their paths. And when we started this work nearly 20 years ago, none of those programs existed. And now they not only exist, but people are talking to each other across the country about what do we need? What kind of scaffolding do we need? How do we create communities for mid and later life transitioners? So I'm grateful to you, Kate, for all you've done to kind of normalize this.
Yeah, and I do think so. The Next Collaborative, just really briefly, is an organization. It's a collective of people in higher ed institutions that are doing this kind of work around midlife transitions or second half of life transitions. And I think too, there's something really exciting about universities being in this space because so many 18 to 22-year-olds come to our campuses trying to figure out, I don't know what I want to do with my life, or what does the world needs, or what skills do I have, or how do I navigate the way that the workplace is changing? And what we find is that people in their 50s, their 40s, their 60s, they're all asking the same questions. And so, I think higher ed is a great place. We have the infrastructure, and I think we also just have opportunities for people to figure out what's next by coming back to our campuses. And that's really what's behind the Nexel Collaborative. I wonder if we could talk a little bit because so much of your current work has to do with intergenerational connection. Could you talk a little bit about that and just, why it's so important, not only in the workplace, but also in how we learn and grow?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of this goes back to the developmental psychologist, Eric Erickson, who really talked about kind of what do we need at each life stage. And really, at mid and later life, a really crucial thing that we need is called generativity. So we get to the point where we can imagine the end of the road. And it's really becomes important to start thinking about what are you investing in that's going to live beyond you. It is why grandparents have this kind of natural generativity built in. Anyone who has experienced grandchild relationships know that there is this kind of natural bond, but that's not the only way to get it. People get it through making art, through building a business, through kind of any kind of work that will live beyond you. Um, I don't have any children, but I'm a writer, and I'd like to think that maybe some of my words would survive. And because I don't have kids of my own, I've been super intentional about thinking about how do I interact with young people, get to know young people, invest in young people, and learn from and with young people. So there is this idea of if you understand the concept of generativity and trying to think about what are your ways into generativity, I think relationship with younger people, whether it's coming through your family, through your workplace, through any community that you are a part of, can be a really vital and very often natural way to get that generativity.
And I do think, there is that sense of midlife being a time where you do start stepping back and say, what impact do I want to have?
Mhm.
How do I, navigate maybe shifting that sense of identity around a successful, perspective to significance. And I know you've written quite a bit about that and talked about that, but just that shift that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is also a generational thing going on. I think many people in the generations we were raised in um, had this idea that you kind of put in your time and then there is like a reward kind of down the road. And many people have made choices. Maybe you were influenced by pressures, by whether there's family pressures, financial pressures. Lots of people talk about kind of what is it like when you've maybe paid off your mortgage or sent the last kid off to school or whatever the things you've been kind of um, working towards. And there might be a sense of freedom or a sense of a second chance, which is where the encore language comes in, right? What would it be like if you had another turn at the stage? If you could kind of try to think about what you might want to do if you were making decisions without outside pressures. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't have pressure at this stage. There are many, many people. I think another thing driving the working longer and going back to school and reinventing is that many of us still need to earn a living. And but maybe we have the freedom to do it in different ways or the desire to do it in different ways than has come before.
Mhm. Yeah, and I do think that whole financial piece is a tough one because I think sometimes people feel stuck in what they're doing because there's a lot of fear around making a pivot to different kind of work. But I think it's really important to think about, maybe there's a couple of different ways to look at that. Maybe there are ways to still make a living and still do the kind of work we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's really important that we be realistic and we not make this look easier than it is. And I think so often, um, and I've seen this, I was a member of the media and I see these articles like, accountant turned, a bed and breakfast owner, or, like these kind of transition kind of stories that make it sound like it happens overnight. And I think the biggest myth we need to dispel is that these transitions take time. They involve detours. They don't happen overnight, and it is not easy. And I don't want to kind of, I think we're talking about something that is essential and that almost all of us are going to wrestle with, but I don't want to make it sound like a snap your fingers kind of experience. You've been around a lot of people going through this. It can involve insecurity, it can involve dead ends, it can involve, um, some really hard moments.
Yeah. And I think some of the messages out there have historically been, do what you love, the money will follow. Don't worry about the money. And I do think there is a realism here of just there's ways that you can start moving in a direction without, giving up your day job. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, just those steps people can start taking.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, all of the kind of ways we talk about this have to do with where you are right at the moment. So if you're still in your job and you're trying to think about the next chapter, in some ways you're quite fortunate, right? Because you have something that you can do while you dip your toe in the water. You could start reading, planning. Maybe you have time for one class or some kind of foray, a volunteer project, something that can kind of get your feet in the water, dip your feet in the water of something new. I've seen people also even use opportunities at their current job, whether it's getting on a committee, a lot of these like affinity groups. I've seen people take on new leadership roles or take an opportunity to learn about something that you're interested in, even in your current role. So all of those are ways to do this. Um, the other way is if you are already kind of transitioned out, you obviously have to figure out, do I need a source of income? And where am I going to do the experiments of gonna to help me figure out what I want to do next? So a lot of it has to do with where you are beginning in this process. But a lot of the techniques are pretty much the same.
Mhm. And I also think people are they're figuring out different ways of working. I mean, there's a whole lot of options that people are exploring that is not just the traditional full-time job. I wonder if you could just mention a little bit, and I know, I mean, the Encore Career Handbook is really about some of those pathways.
Right. So I think one thing I talked to, lots and lots of people at this life stage, and one of the first two things they say to me is, I'm not sure I want to go to an office anymore. I want to work flexibly, and I'm not sure I want to work full time. And kind of like the big news is most employers don't want those things of you. So most employers, or many employers, are not looking for people to come in full time, are not necessarily looking for people or have places for people to come in. And many employers these days don't have budget to hire people full time. So if you can work flexibly, if you can work as a consultant or as a freelancer, you might find that you have way more employment possibilities than if you're looking for a full time or part time job with benefits. So there is, a question of whether you're looking for employment or whether you're looking for work. And I think it's important to separate those things out. So this stage of life might be what I call a slash career, where you're doing something for money, something for passion, something to try something out. And you may have a few parts of your identity. You may continue to live like that, or you may try to braid it all together and find a way to do that in one position.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'd also just add, and don't ignore maybe smaller employers that might have more of those kinds of opportunities or maybe willing to be flexible in those kinds of roles.
I think all of it has to do with thinking about what's happening locally where you are. I mean, obviously, we all know we could do remote work. We could be working kind of on Zoom in a national organization or employer. But one of the benefits of a place like the Midlife Academy is many of the people who connect there are local to the Minneapolis area, and then you're connecting up with a bunch of other people who know what's happening in your market. So figuring out what is happening where you live and finding some local networks to be a part of that usually may have nothing, that could have nothing to do with your working life. You could find those local networks through your volunteer activities, through political activism, through your hiking club. But those are all ways to find out what's happening around you.
Yeah. And I would also say too that networks, that's one area where people 50 plus, 40 plus have some advantages because they have networks. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the value of networks and community.
Yeah, well, I think we all know that most opportunities are not happening because we randomly respond to, LinkedIn or Indeed postings. Most opportunities come because we meet someone or somebody can vouch for us or make an introduction. And one of the benefits of having, some decades behind you is that you have extensive networks. Now, some of us may have neglected our networks, and it's important to figure out in a way that's kind of organic to you, how do you like to get in touch with people? How do you like to reconnect? Everyone who's in a job search knows what it's like to suddenly turn on the LinkedIn switch and realize, oh no, this is really awkward. I'm going to now reach out to people I haven't talked to in 10 years. And I always say, why don't you start with the people you've connected with most recently? Who are the people involved in your current or most recent work? They will be able to speak to your most recent experience, and they know who you are now. So you don't have to go all the way back. And the other thing is, can you expand your networks, or can you tap into networks where you're also in touch with a lot of people younger than you? The older we get, the more likely that the person who's hiring or kind of recruiting in any way is going to be younger than us. And I always tell people, what are the ways you have to plug into networks that are age diverse? I've seen parents who, trade LinkedIn sessions with their younger, or, with their recent grad kids, realizing that sometimes the younger people are in a position to hire, sometimes the older people are in the positions of authority, and maybe you can be helping each other by seeing if you have contacts at places that interest each other. So, be creative about how you're thinking about who's in your network.
I love that idea. And also thinking about just how do you brand yourself, for these kinds of roles, and especially knowing you may be interviewing with someone who's much younger than you.
Yes, yes. And that's a good thing to practice, to get comfortable having work-related conversations with people who are, as you age, who are younger than you, because you will likely report to someone and certainly be working with people who are younger than you.
Mhm. And it gets into a little bit of ageism, and I would say ageism both ways. I wonder if you could say a few things about that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I just want to say is we know that ageism is real. And I'm glad that you mentioned and opened with ageism both ways. All my work these days is intergenerational, so it's very clear to me when I talk to people trying to get their first positions and people at the encore stage that we really share something, but it looks differently. It looks different when you're younger than when you're older. When you're older, it looks like, are you relevant? Are you up to date? Are you feeling current? When you're younger, it's about how you're going to ever get hired when you don't have experience and who's going to give you that chance. So, um, I think we always laugh, my colleagues and I, that there may be this like perfect zone between 40 and 45 where you've got a little experience and you're kind of at the sweet spot of being hired. And maybe those people, maybe it's like, 35 to 45 who are feeling in the prime moment, and they have other pressures. So none of us is in a position that feels strong right now. I think because we're in a position where there's a really tight job market. And when you're in a really tight job market, I think at every stage, you see how that's playing out for your age peers. But there are many, many things we can do to kind of make ourselves in at least the best position we can be in. And the first I would say is try to understand the reputation of places that you're interested in. It's never easy to be the only anything. And if you're the only person over a certain age, that might tell you something about that organization and its friendliness to older workers. And if you're in a position where you're looking for a job, you may not be in a position to be single-handedly trying to eradicate the ageism of a certain employer. You can worry about that once you're on the inside and trying to do some work. And we all have that obligation, I think, to fight ageism as we can. But when you're on the seeking side, I would say the most important thing is to be prepared and to focus on your relevant and recent experience. Most of us are not going to get very far by selling what we did 30 years ago. We're going to get somewhere by selling what we're currently good at, where our recent credentials are. So, have you recently gotten a new kind of training? What have you recently learned? And your resume and the way you present yourself should reflect those things. And you should be ready with stuff to talk about. That's your recent experience, not your kind of decades ago experience. So, that's kind of about mindset too, because if you're feeling qualified and competent, you're going to come across much more confident as you interview.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what are some of the trends you're seeing that I think our audience should be aware of and be on their radar.
Yeah. I have to say, everybody's talking about AI. So I think understanding how AI is coming up in the area that you're interested in, nobody needs to be an expert on AI kind of generally. I think it's important to understand how is AI showing up in the kind of work you're interested in or in the job search. So in the job search, one way that AI is coming up is that it is being used to scan resumes, which is yet another way. It's being used to generate applications. So employers are being flooded by applications and resumes for every potential role, which is another reason why the human touch is ever more important. If that is happening for every job posting, how can you have your application process be much more personal touch? How can
Mhm.
you focus on places where you can get to a human being, where you can get a personal reference so that somebody will pull your application or resume out of the mix? Um, there are also, so the other thing I would say about AI is just understand your sector. So for example, I still consider myself very much connected to the media and journalism sector and publishing and books. And there's a whole lot of conversation about ensuring that we're still committed to personal voice and that we're using AI as a research tool, not as a writing tool. And there are many, many entities with really strong prohibitions on the use of AI. So if I was trying to do freelance writing, for example, I'd be very, very aware that editors are very suspicious of that. So that's again very specific to the industry that you're in. Um, but if you're applying for something or interested in something where understanding the latest AI tool is a big part of the job, then figure out how to get trained to be qualified for that.
Yeah, and I do think I know at our university we have short courses and certificates around that. So I think anywhere that you live, there's probably some way that you can polish up and just understand a little bit more about just the whole area of AI and how it's impacting us generally.
Right. Um, Again, I would say another, trying to think of other trends. I mean, the other thing we can use AI for is to help do some research on the kinds of opportunities. Once you know what it is you want to do, you could be using AI to figure out what kind of trainings might be appropriate, both online, locally. So I would just say understanding what AI could be doing for you and where to be careful about it are really important things to keep in mind.
Yes, and always verify because sometimes,
Always verify, always double check. Yes, do not take it as fact. Um,
yes.
I would say, I don't know if I would say this as a trend, but I think it's certainly an advantage. I think having a peer network as you're going through this kind of transition is really important. And it's a trend in that programs like Midlife Academy are sprouting up and creating communities of us, of people at midlife who are kind of working on their own transitions. And it's really hard to do this without support. It's hard to make these transitions without people you can openly talk to, without people you can, trade stories with, trade advice, bolster each other when it's going hard. So I would say there's a trend in figuring out how to get a support group without having to create it for yourself.
Yeah, and I do think too, I think post-COVID, we have some of those connections have eroded in some ways. And so I do think it is really important to find those places and also just I think that there's some real value in finding a safe place to maybe voice something that might be a little scary to put out in the open, voice a dream, voice something that you're really hoping to do and to have mirrors back to you and people who may also have their own networks. So inevitably we see this happen. Like someone might say they have an interest in something, and someone in the group says, "Hey, I know someone who's doing that. You should talk to." And it happens organically. And I think this is one of the beauties of having some kind of community where people feel safe to, to venture into areas where maybe it was a little scary to do so before.
Hmm. And I think the other I'm trying to get back to trends because I think it's important to I mean, I think one big trend is that there is kind of connected to the longer lives we've been talking about. I think there are trends in the kinds of work that I see a lot of older people really well suited to. And when you understand some of the kind of life stage things that are surrounding us, it opens a door to a lot of work-related opportunities that I think midlife and older people are uniquely suited to. So, for example, healthcare navigators, all kinds of things that have to do with the world of care and caregiving, where as we age, we have probably done and witnessed much more of that. There is a whole growing field of interest in reimagining later life and death. I have encountered three friends in the last year who are exploring being a death doula, which was something I had never heard about years ago. So I think some of the what we call the longevity economy and kind of things that have to do with navigating. I mean, there are architects and designers who are working on how do we make homes more age friendly. There are all kinds of things that relate it to the life stage we're talking about. So I would say think about your lived experience and what you're seeing around you. And often those are good ways to point to looking at what are trends in the market around those areas.
Yeah, and I think too with caregiving, I think people are oftentimes just trying to figure it out for the first time. And then we learn so many things when we've gone that path. And so to be able to look at, there may be marketplaces that maybe we hadn't thought of that now we have some expertise and skills and experience. So that's a great idea. Well, I'd like to pause here and bring Bree in. And Bree, welcome. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the Midlife Academy, and then let's go into some Q&A.
Absolutely. We've got some great questions already lined up, but for those listening, Q&A, drop your questions in and we'll get to those in a moment. Marci, welcome. It's been so great to listen to this conversation and hear so many things that you're saying resonate with really the reasons that Kate and I put this Midlife Academy at the University of Minnesota together. And I was really, really happy to hear you just like come out and say that these kind of midlife transitions are not easy. Having been in the classroom with our participants in the Midlife Academy, seeing all the different kind of midlife transitions, either by choice or things that are kind of foisted upon us that folks are dealing with, and how the Midlife Academy is kind of coming in as a place for folks to navigate these together. So really for the Midlife Academy, which we launched last fall with our first Cultivating Purpose course, the idea was the importance of cohorts and getting folks together to, have a sounding board, to have a force of accountability, social connections, encountering new networks, and doing this together. And the power of doing that together is really what we believed in and what we've seen in these amazing cohorts of people participating in our courses. In addition to courses, though, we're also, trying to reach folks via webinars like this, as well as our podcast series, which is dealing with a variety of different issues pertaining to different midlife issues. Back to the courses, we've been talking about intergenerational connections, and I think just by the fact that we kind of cast midlife as a very kind of capacious time period, our courses attracted folks from their 40s into their 70s. So we naturally had this kind of intergenerational cohort, some folks who were approaching retirement, in retirement, others in the midst of career pivots, many deep in caregiving roles, empty nesters, all these different phases that we're still kind of lumping under this umbrella of midlife, but ways in which we saw folks participating, supporting each other, mentoring each other, teaming up and collaborating on ideas of what their next steps might be. It was just really incredible to see these kinds of connections happening in the courses. very briefly on the two courses that we're offering, we have a course called Cultivating Purpose, facilitated by a wonderful facilitator, Megan Voorhees. Cultivating Purpose is a real fantastic opportunity, really to just kind of slow down for a moment, to develop a vision of yourself and your what's next, whatever that may be, wherever you may be in your life path. Seeking clarity around who you are, maybe kind of getting to know yourself again by taking that time for yourself to really think about your passions, your sparks, and then, hovering around this question of purpose, whether it's a big P purpose or many little P purposes. And I've been through this class and it is transformational. And it really, to me, is like the taking the time to let yourself explore and reconnect with yourself. In addition to cultivating purpose, we also have a class called Next Chapter Reset, Building Momentum, taught by another fabulous facilitator, Courtney Burton. And in Next Chapter Reset, we're really digging into kind of establishing a foundation for a career transition, whether that's a transition into some kind of retirement, encore career/career, but really involving taking the time for experiments with what that next chapter might look like. Once again, building an accountability and connection through the cohort model, but really kind of giving yourself a kind of practical toolkit for the kind of maybe rebranding, identity transformation, network building, required to kind of maybe push yourself into, that next step that you've been perhaps wanting for a long time, but need that extra support that these kind of courses can give you to give you that kind of that push.
And I'd like to just add that, we know that for those of you in our community in the Twin Cities, sometimes having something in person is really appealing. And so the Cultivating Purpose, we're offering a bookends retreat this fall, which has 2 retreat days and then 3 meetings in between via Zoom. But then our other course, the Next Chapter Reset, is fully on Zoom. We kind of go back and forth on what we offer on Zoom, what we offer in person, because we know that not everyone who comes is in our local community. Plus, we also just feel like there's some people that it's just easier in their lives to do something remotely. And I will say both of our facilitators are really good at creating that sense of community, whether it is in person or on Zoom. I mean, that's been the community is one of the biggest factors here that makes a difference. And we are intentional in making sure that we're building that in everything we do. So, Bree, should we pop into some questions?
I would love to. I'd love to. So a pair of questions that came up kind of earlier in the talk, I think responding to your story, Marci, of getting laid off and finding your way into kind of your what's next. So a question being, what advice you have for someone who is having that moment of being laid off, but without some pre-existing relationships or recognition to transition into that new chapter, where to start. And another kind of a follow-up from another respondent, just wondering about someone who may be laid off earlier than they expected, finding themselves approaching a career pivot earlier than what expected, how to go about, kind of, making that seeking those next steps.
Yeah, I think these questions seem braided to me and are asking versions of the same thing. I think in all of this, we have to think both about mindset and also kind of what we can do to work on our mindset, but then also what we can do out in the world to help propel ourselves forward. And I think at every step of the way, we need both of those things. So the first thing I would say is don't try to do this alone. Really try to find community, whether it is one more person who could be a buddy going through this together. Might be good to have somebody who's different than you, who's a different age. I mean, it's all kind of who you encounter. But going to, events like the Midlife Academy or the Modern Elder Academy are many of the places that are increasingly available for us to meet people who are also navigating this life stage. Um, so I would say one thing is like, don't go it alone. And then the second is give yourself a chance to do some experimenting and give yourself permission to understand that every experiment and every foray might not be satisfying. And when it isn't, realize that you can move on and try the next thing. And for the person who said this is happening earlier than planned, you may not have the roadmap, and you really may need to do some work to kind of do some inner questioning. Somebody asked about the value of assessments like strength finders. There's many of them these days. I think those things are valuable. I think it is valuable to act like you're a 20-year-old again, trying to figure out who am I meant to be? What am I attracted to? Where have I excelled in the past? What skills do I have that maybe I haven't been using that I would like to be using? And that is a good way to point yourself in some new directions.
Can I follow up there just to push to hear a little more about experiments? When you talk about little
Mhm.
experiments, what might that look like?
Yeah, here's some examples. If you're interested in something, there are many, many ways to take a next step and learn more. So one is to ask if to meet someone who does that thing and shadow them for a couple of hours or for a day. Early on, when I was leaving the law, and one of the things I was interested in was teaching, but I didn't know what kind of teaching. So I found what was possible to do in my state, and I got a chance to be like a substitute teacher in a middle school for one day. And I went to this middle school, and it was an English class, and I love literature. And like an hour into it, I was like, I don't want to be with a bunch of middle schoolers in this building. I feel like I'm like back in middle school myself. I can't deal with the hormones. It was just so clear that that wasn't right for me. But months later, I had an opportunity to teach a class in an adult education environment because somebody I knew was giving up a class, and he asked me if I would substitute for him for a semester. And that was a bigger experiment. But like literally after the first class, I'm like, this is what I want to do. I want to teach older people. And for 10 years, I had a side hustle teaching freelance journalism at a local community center, a JCC in my neighborhood. And but that first teaching experience helped me to figure out like the population mattered. I didn't just want to teach. I wanted to teach people who really wanted to be in a classroom.
Mhm.
I love the fact that it's not a failed experiment. You tried it and then you fine-tuned it, but you learned something. And so I think sometimes, people are a little hesitant, well, that was failed, but it's not a failure. It's honing in on what you want.
Right, right.
So another question here that I think is really important is someone who's saying, they're interested in making the transition, but what holds them back is the employer-based healthcare benefits for themselves and their family. These kinds of things where, we have, the big dreams, and then, these realities of caring for families and healthcare. Any advice on how to approach these kind of questions?
This is kind of the most common conversation of my age right now. I'm 60 years old, and I can't tell you how many people exactly my age are thinking like, can I stick it out another, 5 years to do the thing I want to do next? So, I've seen many, many kind of approaches to this. I've seen people who figure out how many hours they need to work in their current job and negotiate some kind of part-time that allows them to maintain their insurance while they're moving into something else. That is one method. I have seen people leave and take a job just for the insurance. I can't tell you how many people go to work at Trader Joe's to get that insurance while they're figuring out something else. And maybe it's an hourly job that helps them, or Starbucks or wherever it is that you can work the number of hours that provides you with insurance and also gives you kind of some space to figure out your next steps. So this is real. We have a broken healthcare system in our country, and many of us are, stay in jobs because we need that safety net. So it's a highly individualized question. The other thing I would say is if you're hanging on somewhere for the health insurance and you can keep your job, then there's a moment of thinking, what can you do to set yourself up with a longer runway? Are there classes you want to take? Are there skills you want to build in the meantime so that when you're ready to make that, you used the time while you were still at your job to be ready for that next transition?
I can go with the next question, Bree. There's a question here about grief. Not only grief of just, as we get to midlife and beyond, we experience grief of losing family and friends, but there's also the grief of relationships, the lost dreams, loss of social infrastructure that we thought would be there. Can you speak about how you approach the topic of grief at midlife?
Mm. I'm happy to start, but Bree, did you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Marcy. We'd love to hear.
Okay. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but um, I really believe that grief is another area where you don't have to go it alone. I think that question probably resonates with many people because there is no way you've gotten to this life stage without a lot of loss. And I think we are not trained as a society on how to deal with continued loss and the kinds of transitions that are constantly going to be upon us as we age. There is a beautiful book called Renegade Grief by Carla Fernandez. She is the co-founder of one of our fellows started this organization with her. It's called the Dinner Party. And this was a group started for younger people experiencing grief. And they created these groups, these grief circles. Um, they started on college campuses, but now the dinner party is operating autonomously and in a self-organized way with these idea that many people who are going through certain kinds of grief can benefit from people who are having the same kind of grief. So grief of losing a child might be different from grief around a divorce or grief around another loss of a parent. So I think finding your community is really important. Some people get it through their faith community, but you'd think that you'd hit midlife and you know how to hold these things that come to us. But if you haven't yet found your method, I think this is a time to really think about what is the way that feels most natural to you. Because one thing we know about aging is that there is going to be increasing loss. It is just part of the package.
And I had an uncle, he lived to age 95, and of course he experienced a lot of loss, but his part of his strategy that he talked about was to have younger friends.
Mm, yeah.
And also just was a great buffer for him to have intergenerational relationships.
Yeah, and I think like that's what I mean, so much of what we do at CoGenerate is about. And my personal practice is I collect older and younger friends and I try to put myself in places where I'll find them. So for years, I was a mentor in a mentoring or an intergenerational mentoring program for writers, and it's called Girls Write Now, WRITE. And it started in New York where I live. And as I said before, I don't have any kids. And I was like, how am I going to meet like young people in my city when I don't have a kid in school? Like I just was seeing all my friends who are parents who had this natural way that they were having a community of younger people. And what ended up happening is I met all these other younger writers who became many became friends, but they also became part of my professional circle. And I have deep, deep relationships. I also met older people who were I eventually joined the board, and many of the board members were older than me, kind of feminist icons who I was, enamored of. So I think, Kate, you're entirely right that I think having people who are different life stages can help you also put grief in perspective and get a sense of how we could support each other.
I want to kind of keep us on this theme of grief, but pivot a little bit to a question that came in earlier about identity. I'm
Mm,
wondering about the grieving of a former identity that either no longer fits us or through a career change is no longer who we are, but an identity that maybe we put a lot of stock in. How do
mm.
we navigate that type of grief?
It's a hard one. I've done it a few times. So, I I was a journalist for a decade and I was very proud of my identity as a journalist. I had worked really hard to do that work and to get to that identity. And I think one way that has helped me is that I figured out if there was something that connected me to that world that felt appropriate when I made a shift. So when I made a shift to being a nonprofit leader, which is what I am now, I have this link to journalism by being an occasional, I write essays now, so I'm an occasional contributor to many publications. I also have found a way in that the intergenerational work I do gets me invited to certain media and journalism circles because I've found this kind of intersection. And I introduce myself as a former journalist, and I then suddenly have credibility with those people. But I'm being honest that that is not my current identity. So there might be alumni activities for the profession or the group that you are a part of, or there may be a way to change your relationship to that identity. Perhaps there are mentoring opportunities that could put you in touch with people who are currently in that role, who may want to learn from people who have inhabited that role. Um, so it's different in every situation, but I do think it's also important to both acknowledge the loss, process it, and maybe figure it out if you can have a new relationship to it.
I really like that it's not some kind of hard stop of past life, new life, rather, the things that excited you about whatever that first career was, those don't change. That's still who you are, and there's other ways of engaging. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And we have another question here. Just can you speak if there's differences or needs based on gender? Are you seeing more females interested or active in this work than men?
I'd love to hear your experience at the Midlife Academy. I hate to make gendered assumptions because I think there are, like with age, I think there are always people who defy what we think about are the norms. But I would say that people who are used to processing out loud or processing in community um, are drawn to the kind of things that we've been talking about. Um, I don't know that that's necessarily our more female than male kind of attribute. Um, but I would say, um, anecdotally, we do see um, that women are pretty comfortable talking about what's going on with them and being vulnerable. So I think increasingly I'm seeing more spaces for men to have these kinds of communities. And I think um, I would encourage men who are participating here or people to talk to the men in their lives about how do you find those kinds of spaces? My husband is a great example. I'm involved in many, many groups, and he has found great meaning and community in a support group that he got involved in when he had prostate cancer, which is a very common kind of experience for men in this age group. And I think he could have never gotten through that experience without a group of peers that he could openly talk to. And he surprised himself at how powerful that experience was for him. Um, so I would say we're all different. Uh, but I think finding your own way into what kind of community you're comfortable with, um, I really do think this is not a stage to navigate on your own.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think, men, women, non-binary folks, I mean, this is important to all of us to find that community. And I think for those of us who are trying to create community, it's really on us to make sure that people feel welcomed and see themselves in the community. And I know that we've had, both men, women, non-binary folks come through and feel like they get a lot out of it because I do think the process of getting that sense of community, that sense of having other people support us as we make these transitions is so powerful. I think we all need it. And I think, sometimes people might feel, most at home in certain different communities, um, but everyone's welcome. And everyone, I think, does need those kinds of communities. So, Bree, any last minute questions that you are seeing as we wind up here?
We're all eager readers. Could you recommend a couple books that might be a good place for folks to start that are wanting to dig deeper into this topic, Marcy?
Yeah, I said I answered a few in the chat. Carrie Hannon, a dear friend of Kate and mine, has been one of the most prolific authors in this space. She does a lot of very nuts and bolts, practical stuff on the job stuff. I still think my colleague Mark Friedman's books and Chip Conley's books are really beautiful on like the philosophical parts of all of this. Lately, this is not a book, but I'm a huge fan of the writer Sari Botton, Botton, who started a Substack called Oldster recently, and I am just addicted to it. It is a magazine about reflecting on aging with the recognition that we are all aging all the time. All of us are oldsters. Really love what she's doing over there.
And I'll just add Chris Farrell's books. Chris is
Mm,
delightful, and his writing is wonderful. He's an economics writer, and he has a book called Purpose and a Paycheck, which I think is really on target with how a lot of people are looking at this. And then he also has a book, it's an older book, but it's called The New Frugality. And I just love that book. And I don't know that it got as much press as his other books, but it's really about building your life around and your money decisions around what's most important to you and letting go of some things that maybe are not as important. And so, I loved that book.
agreed. Huge fan of Chris and that book.
Yes. So if you could give one piece of advice to someone who feels stuck in their current career now, what would it be?
Go out and do some experiments. They can be really small, volunteer somewhere, take yourself on an afternoon retreat to kind of clear your head and dream a little, find a buddy to go through this with together, but do a little experiment. It doesn't have to be big. And even if it fails, it's teaching you something and go on to the next.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Marcy. Thank you, Bree and Grayson. And thank you all for coming here today. I would also like to mention that we do have another webinar coming up in September, and it's called Real Talk Caregiving at Midlife. We know that's an important issue. We hear about it all the time. So thank you all, and you can visit our website for more details on any of our courses, midlife.umn.edu. Thank you so much.